I had never been a fan of airports. The long lines, the waiting, and the constant noise always made me uneasy. But that day, I had no choice. I had to catch my flight, and I arrived at the airport much earlier than usual. The terminal was quieter than expected for a busy airport, almost too quiet. I remember noticing the silence more than anything. There were fewer people than I anticipated, and the hum of distant conversations and announcements felt strangely muffled. I made my way through security without any issues and went to find my gate. The airport seemed almost abandoned, despite the few passengers scattered around. I sat near the window, trying to relax, but something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently. It wasn't until I saw the man standing by the hallway near the restroom that my unease turned into real fear. He was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned gray suit that didn't seem to fit the modern setting of the airport. His face was pale, too pale, and he stood perfectly still, staring at the ground. I couldn't see his eyes, and something about the way he stood made me feel like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that he was just another tired traveler. But the feeling persisted. I couldn't look away from him, as if some invisible force was pulling my gaze in his direction. A few minutes later, I glanced back, and he was still there, standing in the exact same position. It felt like hours had passed in those few moments. I started to wonder if I had imagined it, but no. He was real. And what scared me more was that no one else seemed to notice him. I looked around at the other passengers sitting nearby, but they were all either engrossed in their phones or reading, completely oblivious to the strange figure by the restroom. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Something felt wrong. I stood up and walked toward the vending machines to grab a snack. But as I passed the hallway where the man stood, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I glanced at him again. This time, he wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking directly at me. I stopped in my tracks, heart racing. His face was now clear, too clear. His eyes were empty, black voids, and his lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. I could hear my breath catch in my throat as I hurriedly turned away, my footsteps echoing in the quiet terminal. I didn't want to go back to my seat, but I had no choice. I was too shaken to move any further, so I returned to my spot, trying to act normal. I looked over my shoulder again, and the man was still there, standing in the same spot. But this time, he wasn't just standing. He was moving slowly toward me, his steps soundless, gliding across the floor with an unnatural smoothness. My heart began to pound harder. I couldn't understand why no one else noticed. I stood up again, ready to leave the gate area, but something stopped me. A voice inside my head whispered, "Don't go back. Don't turn around." It was as if the air around me thickened, and I couldn't breathe properly. My legs felt weak, my body frozen in place. I didn't dare look behind me, but I knew he was getting closer. That's when I heard it. A faint, whispering sound, like someone speaking directly into my ear. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. It was a warning. I spun around quickly, my pulse racing. The man was gone. In his place was only the empty hallway leading to the restrooms. And everything seemed as it should be. The lights above flickered once more before stabilizing. Was it my imagination? Had I just seen something that wasn't there? I couldn't say for sure, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. I glanced around. and the terminal seemed normal again. No sign of the man, but deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, had been there. Something was wrong with that airport, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what. When the announcement for my flight came over the intercom, I hurried to board the plane, desperate to get away from the eerie atmosphere of the airport. As I walked down the jet bridge, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. And in the distance, at the far end of the terminal, I thought I saw him again. The man in the grey suit, standing still, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. I thought that once I was on the plane, everything would be fine. I tried to convince myself that the strange man in the airport was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. But as the plane ascended into the sky, the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. The plane was nearly full, but the air felt thick with an uncomfortable tension. Like everyone else was in on something, I wasn't. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but it wasn't helping. The sensation of being watched lingered, even though I couldn't point to anything specific. Every few minutes, I glanced around the cabin, looking for something out of place. But there was nothing. No unusual faces, no odd behavior, just the hum of the engines and the soft murmur of conversation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I closed my eyes for a moment, hoping to ease my nerves, but then the turbulence started. It was subtle at first, just a slight shudder in the air, nothing too alarming. But soon it grew worse, and the plane began to bounce more violently, sending a ripple of anxiety through the passengers. The overhead lights flickered. The cabin grew dimmer. I gripped the armrest, heart racing. This wasn't just bad weather. This felt unnatural. "Please remain calm," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "We are experiencing some minor turbulence. Please stay in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control." But I didn't feel reassured. The plane jerked again, harder this time, causing the overhead compartments to rattle. The seatbelt sign flickered on and off erratically, and I heard a soft thud from behind me. It was followed by a whispering sound, faint but unmistakable, like someone was breathing too close to my ear. I spun around quickly, but there was no one behind me. My eyes scanned the aisle, but it was empty. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I turned back toward the front. The whispering continued, only now it was louder, closer, like someone was just behind my seat. I leaned forward, glancing around again. I could see the faces of the other passengers, their expressions locked in fear, their eyes wide with anxiety as the turbulence worsened. But then, my stomach dropped. There, at the back of the plane, standing in the narrow aisle between the rows of seats, was the man in the grey suit. He wasn't sitting. He wasn't standing still like he had been in the airport. This time, he was walking toward me. Slowly, deliberately, his steps soundless against the hum of the airplane's engines. My heart raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. How could he be here? I had been the only one to notice him in the airport, so why was he here now? Why was he following me? I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my vision narrowing. The man didn't acknowledge anyone else around him. His gaze was fixed solely on me, those hollow eyes burning into mine. The smile that had been on his lips in the airport was now stretched wide, a grotesque grin that sent a wave of cold terror through my body. Why, why are you doing this? I wanted to shout, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just watched as he continued to move toward me, his movements slow but inevitable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the plane's turbulence seemed to intensify with his approach. Just when I thought he would reach me, the lights flickered again, and I felt a sudden drop in my stomach as the plane lurched violently. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and chaos erupted around me. The screams of the other passengers blended with the roar of the engines, but all I could focus on was the figure at the back of the plane. In that split second of panic, I turned my head away. I closed my eyes tightly, gripping my seat with both hands. When I opened them again, the man was gone. There was no trace of him anywhere. The lights flickered back on, and the turbulence stopped as abruptly as it had started. Everything felt silent. I was shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I looked around the cabin, but the other passengers were just as they had been before, seemingly unaffected by what had just happened. They were going about their business, some adjusting their masks, others buckling their seatbelts. Nobody seemed to have noticed the figure in the back of the plane, let alone the terror I had just experienced. "Is everything okay?" a flight attendant asked as she walked past me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. What had just happened? Was it a hallucination? Had I imagined the whole thing? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too real. The man in the gray suit had been on the plane. He had followed me, and even though he had disappeared, I could still feel his presence in the back of my mind, like an unshakable shadow that would haunt me for the rest of my journey. As the plane began to level off and the seatbelt sign went off, I tried to calm myself, but my thoughts raced. I wanted to believe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me, but something in my gut told me that this was far from over. The man in the airport, the turbulence, the whispering, it was all connected somehow, and I didn't know how or why, but I had a feeling that it wouldn't be the last time I would encounter him. I don't know how much time had passed since the turbulence stopped, but it felt like an eternity. The chaos that had erupted earlier seemed to fade as the flight attendants reassured everyone that everything was fine. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I could still hear the man's whispering voice echoing in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about those hollow, empty eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, his face appeared before me, staring, waiting. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. I tried my best to focus on anything that would distract me from the unease gnawing at me. I even tried to strike up a conversation with the person sitting next to me, but their words barely registered as my mind replayed the haunting encounter. It felt like I was in a daze, completely disconnected from everything around me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it was just a bad experience, a part of me knew, deep down, that it wasn't. As the plane began its descent toward our destination, the unease intensified. The lights in the cabin dimmed once more, flickering erratically. The hum of the engines grew louder, almost deafening. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight and my hands trembled. I looked out the window, trying to calm myself by focusing on the distant lights of the city below. But even that brought no comfort. The sky had turned an unnatural shade of dark gray, and the storm clouds seemed to roll in from nowhere. Then it happened. The voice, his voice, whispered again, this time much louder and clearer than before. It wasn't coming from outside or from anywhere I could physically point to. It was inside my head, a low rasping sound that made my skin crawl. It's not over. It's just beginning. My heart stopped. I tried to look around, but everyone else seemed perfectly calm, oblivious to what I was hearing. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, performing their safety checks as if nothing was wrong. And the other passengers continued to stare out the windows or chat among themselves. It was as if the entire world was moving in slow motion around me, and I was the only one stuck in a nightmare. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it sounded distorted. The words were slurred, like someone was speaking through a broken speaker. The once reassuring tone now carried an unsettling edge. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some issues with the flight. Please remain in your seats. Prepare for an unexpected. The message cut off abruptly, and the plane lurched once more, far more violently than before. This time, there was no mistaking it. The plane was plummeting. Passengers screamed in panic, their faces twisted in terror. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and the cabin erupted into chaos as everyone scrambled to put them on. I could hear the frantic voices of flight attendants trying to calm people down, but it all felt distant, like a muffled echo. My hands went clammy as I fumbled to secure my mask. My heart raced as the plane descended rapidly. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, the plane stabilized. The screaming stopped. The lights flickered once more, and then everything fell silent. It was as though the whole world had paused, holding its breath. I couldn't make sense of it. The turbulence had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the passengers, who had just been in full-blown panic, were now eerily quiet, staring ahead with wide, confused eyes. That's when I heard the sound again. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, just like in the airport. I turned my head, heart racing, and there he was, the man in the grey suit. But this time, he wasn't at the back of the plane. He was right there, standing in the aisle, just a few feet away from me. His eyes locked with mine, the empty black voids seeming to pull me in. His smile was wider now, distorted in a way that made my stomach churn. He stepped closer, and the whispers began again, louder this time, swirling around me, filling my head with 1,000 voices. You can't escape it. It's too late. You're already part of it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I couldn't look away. My breath came in ragged gasps as the figure approached. The other passengers were still staring ahead, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding right before their eyes. I reached out to grab the arm of the person sitting next to me, but my hand passed through them. They were no longer there. I looked around in a panic, and to my horror, the entire cabin was empty. The man was the only one left on the plane with me. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, and the lights flickered again, but this time they went out entirely. The plane was plunged into darkness. I could still hear the man's footsteps, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. And then I felt it, his cold, clammy hand brushing against my shoulder. A shock of icy fear surged through me, paralyzing me. I couldn't take it any longer. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The only response, the man's laughter, soft and chilling. It echoed around me, bouncing off the walls of the now phantom plane. He whispered again, but this time, his voice wasn't just in my head. It was in the air around me, in every corner of the cabin, in the very fabric of the plane itself. This is the end. You're never leaving. The last thing I remember was the sensation of falling. I felt my body hurtling through space, weightless and hopeless, until everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer on the plane. The cold, sterile air of the airport terminal surrounded me. But it wasn't the airport I had boarded from. The walls were cracked and peeling, the lights dim and flickering erratically. I could hear distant voices, but none of them made sense. I stood up, my legs weak and trembling beneath me, and as I looked around, I realized the truth. The airport was empty, and there, standing in front of me, was the man in the grey suit. His smile was the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me once more.